Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to get my day started. Get my squats and everything going. Today I thought I would talk with you guys a little bit about why it's important to train movement patterns instead of body parts, and to use external cueing instead of internal cueing on your lifts if your goal is to gain muscle. And now a lot of people are going to say, well, Jason, a lot of this advice you're giving here is just for general size, to put as much size on you as possible. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to build a certain type of physique. And I can tell you right now, the overwhelming majority of people on YouTube Fitness who are here looking for training advice are not at a point in their development where they need to be thinking in those terms, meaning most of you guys out there who are even chasing that aesthetic physique, you still haven't built a base yet. And for the most part, your aesthetics are going to come from basically genetics and dieting down lean enough. So the thing is, there's a lot of people out there who you might look at and say, oh, they don't have an aesthetic physique, they have a lot of bulk. Yeah, but if they were to diet 20 pounds of body fat off, they would look pretty aesthetic by your standards because they have built a large amount of muscle mass through their entire body. So it's a point that cannot be forgotten there, that most of you guys, your aesthetics are going to be okay as far as your genetics are concerned. Because again, we all have our structural limitations. As long as you have put reasonable amounts of muscle mass in every muscle in your body, and then you diet down. And that's the difference, guys. That look everyone is thinking of comes largely from a low body fat percentage with a reasonable amount of muscle balance. And that's the point that we get to with the muscle balance. And people need to realize there's a lot of people who are trying to gain muscle for other reasons than that. They might need it for work purposes, maybe the type of work they do. Again, something to where the police officers, firefighters, things like that. Those people might need to just gain it in general, or for being a field athlete, or just because they want to be big and strong. So there's a lot of reasons why people need to gain muscle, but the point is, for everyone, you're going to have to build a base. And that base comes best by training movement patterns. And we'll get to the cueing in a second. The reason I say movement patterns, because the big basic movements tend to build the most muscle on you. When I say patterns, I don't mean that I'm saying, oh, you have to do the bench press. I'm saying that the bench press or the weighted dip, those are both similar movement patterns. And we could argue, for example, that the weighted dip is a superior muscle builder to the bench press. But the bench press is a great muscle builder. But the bench press is easier to program. It doesn't have as ambiguous of a range of motion, and in some cases, it's less injury prone for some people because the weighted dip has its own set of issues. But we would argue that there's similar movement patterns with the weighted dip, because it involves more muscles, has more potential for muscle mass gains. And again, we come back to that point of people saying, well, I want to have a balanced physique. Well, building muscle with big movement patterns that work a lot of muscles will give you good muscle balance. You're less likely to have something lagging than when you start trying to focus on body parts and every little detail. You can very quickly leave things neglected. But a perfect example, if a person were to get really strong, I'll say the weighted dip, the weighted chin up, and the standing barbell press, there's not going to be any muscles in their upper body that aren't being worked significantly. Those three movements will give you reasonable development in your forearms, biceps, triceps, pecs, and that includes both the upper and lower pec, your lats, your rear delts, side delts, traps. All that stuff is going to get worked to a reasonable degree with those three exercises. In fact, even your abs. So if you were to pick those and focus really heavily on those three basic movement patterns, you're not going to have any massive glaring imbalances in your upper body short of whatever your genetics are. Some of us are just more genetically prone to some things. Guys like me, I don't have the best arm insertions and I have a really thick rib cage. So I'm going to tend to be torso dominant if I have trained in a balanced way. And someone else might have, again, better arm insertions, and they might have a smaller rib cage, so they might tend to look a little more arm dominant. But the point is, you're still going to be relatively balanced relative to your structure. And if you have other things that aren't developing, you can always work on that later. But in the meantime, doing something like that would nearly maximize the amount of muscle in a proportionate way that you could develop through your upper body, because every muscle is being worked. And the same thing when we start coming and messing with lower body stuff. Squats, deadlifts, variations of those things can pretty well maximally develop your lower body. And those also contribute to your upper body. And that's, again, the point we come back to. Squats and deadlifts do work certain parts of the upper body. They do build certain parts of the upper body. And at the end of the day, if you're doing big, basic movement patterns and you're getting sufficient volume and workload with all of them, every muscle in your body is probably going to be receiving close to its maximum growth stimulation. And we come back to that point of people saying, well, I know I'm going to have this imbalance or that. It's my genetic. You probably don't know that till you've actually put on 20 pounds of solid muscle. You probably don't know what that is. And it's better to go ahead and maximally develop everything. And then if you decide later, because again, I don't get into the bodybuilding thing, but I do grasp that a lot of you younger guys, that's why you're training. And that's okay. I would rather you do train for that than to not train at all. But the point is, you can always slow down the growth later in other areas. Meaning if you have certain muscles that aren't in proportion to where you want it, you can just stop progressing on the lifts that hit the other muscles the most to put a little more effort into them. You don't necessarily need to say, hey, I need to make this muscle grow faster early on. Just build everything and then worry about bringing up the weak points by just slowing down what you're doing for the other stuff. If your pecs are getting too big for your arms, maybe focus a little less on your weighted dips and bench press. You know, it's that simple. It really is. But I can assure you that for the majority of you out there, you still want to gain muscle everywhere, even if you have certain body parts that you care about more. You still probably have lagging muscles through your entire body, and it's best to do it that way. Focus on these big movement patterns. And when you're focusing on movement patterns instead of body parts, not only do you tend to gain more muscle overall, you tend to create fewer muscle imbalances that lead to injuries. In other words, you're going to have better longevity in your training, and if you're training these correctly, you're less likely to get hurt. And you're going to be more athletic overall when it comes to other endeavors outside of the weight room. So there's a lot of perks to that also. Now we come to the internal versus external cueing. Again, it comes back to the same point. Again, all this data has been looked at saying, hey, the mind-muscle connection is real. Mind-muscle connection is what you call internal cueing. You're focusing on a given muscle. But like all the data has shown is that when you try to lift with good form as explosively as you can, it recruits more muscle fibers than the mind-muscle connection does. In other words, back to the point we always make about the bench press study that was done, that people who bench press just trying to use decent form, EMG studies, they found they got a certain amount of recruitment in their triceps, their pecs, their front delts, all of that. When they focused more on the chest, the EMG lit up slightly more in the chest. When they focused more on the triceps, the EMG focused slightly more on the triceps, right? They got better recruitment through that internal cueing. But when they did external cueing, which was explode as hard as possible, while maintaining good form, meaning don't just flop around with the weight, but with good form to explode as hard as you could all the way through, they got better recruitment in the triceps and the chest, even better than what they got when they focused on those individual muscles. So we come back to the point of external cueing will put more overall size on you. It will put more overall size on you. And we start talking about radiant effect and everything else. When you start looking at these individual muscles, when you use external cueing, you also tend to get less focus on individual heads. So in other words, your triceps, if you're doing these exercises, a couple of different exercises that use the triceps heavily with a large amount of external cueing, the entire tricep has to work harder. In other words, you're going to be less likely to develop lagging heads of those muscles that you will with too much isolation work that maybe neglects them. And with a good balance of exercises, it sorts that out, because people say, well, the long head might lag as a result of just doing a bunch of dips or bench presses. Yeah, but the overhead press works the long head more. Weighted chin-ups, if you go all the way to the bottom, actually put a stretch reflex on the long head of the tricep. So again, if you're training a balance of movement patterns and putting your focus in those, again, the big movements tend to do a lot of secondary work in other muscles. Like the chin-up, for example, has been found, even though you think of it as a back and bicep and trap exercise, and rear delt exercise, it works the long head of the tricep. It works the upper chest. Same thing, we go to weighted dips. Again, people would think of those, oh yeah, that's similar to a bench press. It just works the pecs, the front delts, the triceps. Well, no, it actually works the lats because of the angle and the stabilizing involved. It actually tends to cause some lats, a reasonable amount of lat stimulation also. In addition to the fact we go to that external cueing of exploding harder, the front delt then has more of a radiant effect through the medial delt and all of that. So if you're doing big movement patterns and you're focused on lifting heavy weights as quickly as possible with good form, you will get more overall muscle fiber recruitment through your entire body, and you will get more overall gains as a result of it. And at the end of the day, I can assure you the overwhelming majority of you out there training, there's going to be some exceptions listening, are not at a point in their development where they need to start specializing and thinking in terms of, I need to start scaling back training this muscle to train this other muscle. Again, unless you are, again, a serious bodybuilder or physique competitor, or maybe a serious athlete who has those things to balance out, you're probably not in that situation just yet. You could probably do better to just go ahead and add more of everything. Because again, most of you out there, I promise you, adding a drop more pectoral to go with the extra tricep you're trying to build probably is not going to imbalance you any further. So just food for thought with all of that. So again, people need to think less about body part training and more about movement pattern training so that they can build more overall muscle mass. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.